Everything we know about the lives of primitive people often boils down to a few stereotypes. Stone axes, animal skins, caves, and mammoth hunting. We imagine a life full of adventure, but in reality, most of their existence was devoted not to heroic deeds, but to the search for food. Hunger was a constant companion, and death from exhaustion was commonplace. And in this world where survival depended on resourcefulness, people developed incredible strategies. They learned to see food where we, modern humans, see only inedible things. They created a hunger menu, a set of rules, knowledge, and practices that allowed our species not only to survive, but also to become dominant on the planet. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn what this life-saving menu was and why studying it today can be useful. When we think about the diet of primitive man, we usually imagine meat and fruit. However, this is a very simplified picture. The reality was much harsher. The main problem was that high-calorie and nutritious food, meat from large animals or ripe fruit, was not always available. And in conditions of scarcity, our ancestors had to be resourceful to obtain food. One of the most unexpected sources of food is tree bark. The inner layer of pine, birch, or spruce bark contains carbohydrates and some nutrients. Of course, it is not the most delicious food, but in conditions of starvation, it could save you from certain death. The bark was stripped, dried, ground, and mixed with other foods. Researchers have found that birch bark contains many nutrients, so it was ground and then cooked like porridge. This practice, incidentally, has survived among some northern peoples to this day. Another example is insects. They were and remain a very nutritious source of protein and fat. Locusts, beetle larvae, ant eggs, all of these were part of our ancestors' diet. Today, most of us find this disgusting, but for primitive man, it was a normal and reliable source of calories, available at any time of the year. Insects could be fried, dried, or eaten raw. But that's not all. Even carrion was used. It's not the most pleasant thing to do, but when it comes to survival, there is no choice. Meat left behind by predators, if it hadn't gone bad yet, was a real gift. Thanks to carrion, our ancestors got protein, fat, and calories without wasting energy on exhausting hunts. You have to admit, it's a very unusual food. In addition, primitive people actively used even what we today consider waste. For example, they learned to extract nutrients from the bones that remained after cutting up carcasses. By breaking the bones with stones, they gained access to bone marrow, which was rich in fat and nutrients. This was an incredibly valuable resource, especially during the cold season. Fat was the most concentrated source of energy, and every drop was worth its weight in gold. The diet also included other seemingly inedible parts of animals, internal organs. The liver, kidneys, and even eyes were rich in vitamins and minerals that were lacking in the meager diet. Modern research shows that animal liver contains large amounts of vitamin C, which helped our ancestors avoid scurvy in the winter when plant foods were unavailable. This approach to nutrition reflects not only their need, but also their deep knowledge of nature. No resource was left unnoticed. It was a kind of survival science passed down from generation to generation. In addition, they learned to use parts of plants that we consider useless. For example, they ate seeds, nuts, and even pollen. Pollen, although not very caloric, contains many vitamins and minerals that were important for maintaining health. This knowledge was very valuable, as it allowed them to survive in conditions where no other food was available. Archaeological finds confirm that their diet included not only large animals and fruits, but also many small, seemingly useless things. They were also masters at using every available resource. For example, they did not just eat meat, but also used the skin, bones, and even tendons to make clothing, tools, and dwellings. It was a waste-free approach to survival that allowed them not only to feed themselves, but also to create everything they needed for life. It was not just survival, but a real art that we, modern people, have almost lost. Primitive man was not just a hunter, but also an incredibly inventive gatherer who used every available resource. This was the basis of the hunger menu, a set of practices that allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive. In today's world, where food is abundant, we can't even imagine what it's like when every crumb counts. Now imagine what you would eat first if you found yourself in the primitive world, and write about it in the comments. In addition to bark, insects, and carrion, primitive people actively used all available resources. For example, they gathered edible tubers and roots that they found underground. These were not only nutritious, but also quite reliable sources of food, as they could be found at any time of the year, even in winter. The roots were dug up with primitive digging sticks and eaten raw or roasted over a fire. Another important source of nutrition was bone marrow. After hunting large animals, even if the meat was eaten, the bones remained. Our ancestors learned to extract valuable bone marrow from them, which contains a lot of fat, and fat is the most concentrated source of energy. They broke the bones with stones and sucked out the marrow, which was a very effective and sensible practice in conditions where every calorie was worth its weight in gold. But what to do about vitamins, especially in winter, when there are no berries or fruits? Primitive man also had an answer to this question. It turned out that not only plant foods, but also animal foods were an excellent source of vitamin C, for example. Our ancestors ate animal offal, such as liver and intestines. Internal organs, especially in northern animals, contain many vitamins that help them survive in harsh conditions, and these vitamins, in turn, were passed on to those who ate them. In addition to this, they learned to cook food, which made it not only more digestible, but also safer. For example, they roasted or boiled bones and even stones to extract nutrients from them. Such cooking methods allowed them to survive in conditions where food was not only scarce but also not always nutritious. Surprisingly, our ancestors did not even need to hunt themselves to access these energy sources. There are theories that early hominins often followed the tracks of large predators, such as saber-toothed tigers or hyenas. After the predators had eaten their fill, they left behind carcasses that still contained bone marrow and some internal organs. This approach required incredible courage, but it allowed them to obtain nutrients without exhausting and dangerous hunting. Our ancestors probably did not disdain insects, but in large quantities. For example, termites and insect larvae found in rotten wood were a valuable source of protein. Scientists have even found traces of this in fossilized feces, known as coprolites. Analysis of these findings shows that the diet was much broader than we thought. All this suggests that primitive people were masters at using every available resource. Our ancestors' diet was so flexible that it even included poisonous plants. They knew how to process them to make them safe to eat. For example, some types of poisonous tubers could be soaked in water or baked to neutralize the toxins. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and was vital for survival. Scientists suggest that this knowledge was so valuable that it was passed on not only orally, but also through cave paintings. In addition, they used fire not only for cooking, but also for preserving food. For example, smoking meat and fish allowed them to be stored for much longer. The smoke from the fire created a protective layer that prevented the growth of bacteria and fungi. This method of storage was especially important in conditions where it was not possible to freeze food. All these practices, from drying meat to making bread, were part of a complex survival system. They allowed our ancestors not only to survive, but to thrive. They passed this knowledge down from generation to generation, creating a kind of cultural heritage. It was an unwritten survival guide that allowed them to adapt to the harshest conditions. It is thanks to this ingenuity that our species was able to spread across the planet and become dominant. Have you ever wondered what ingenuity means in a situation where every mistake can cost you your life? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. Don't think that the hunger menu was just a set of foods. It was also a whole philosophy that helped our ancestors survive. They were masters at using the most unexpected resources. For example, they learned to use fat to extend the shelf life of food. They covered meat with a layer of fat and then froze it, which allowed them to preserve food for a long time. And in the absence of refrigerators, this was a real lifesaver. In addition, they used various storage methods, such as drying meat and fish in the sun or wind. These were very simple but effective techniques that allowed them to stockpile food in case of famine. In this way, they were able to build up reserves that helped them survive the harshest times. Another example is the use of honey. When our ancestors found wild honey, it was a real celebration. Honey is not only a source of sugar and energy, but also an antiseptic. They used it to treat wounds and as a preservative. Honey was collected from beehives found in tree hollows, which incidentally was a very dangerous activity. But the reward was worth it. But that's not all. Primitive people learned to distinguish edible mushrooms and plants from poisonous ones. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and was vital for survival. They knew which plants could be used as medicine and which could be used to repel insects. They also knew how to prepare poisonous plants to make them edible, which was a real skill. This shows that survival in those days was not just a matter of strength, but also of wisdom and knowledge. They also knew how to use fire not only for cooking, but also for preserving food. For example, smoking meat and fish allowed them to be stored for much longer. The smoke from the fire created a protective layer that prevented the growth of bacteria and fungi. This method of storage was especially important in conditions where it was not possible to freeze food. Another example of ingenuity is the creation of so-called primitive bread. Scientists have found traces of ground wild grains and nuts in ancient settlements, which were probably mixed with water and baked on hot stones. This was not just food, but one of the first steps towards agriculture and a sedentary lifestyle. It showed that our ancestors were not only hunters, but also clever engineers. All these practices, from drying meat to making bread, were part of a complex survival system. They allowed our ancestors not only to survive, but to thrive. They passed this knowledge down from generation to generation, creating a kind of cultural baggage. It was an unwritten survival guide that allowed them to adapt to the harshest conditions. It was thanks to this ingenuity that our species was able to spread across the planet and become dominant. In addition, our ancestors developed a kind of collective mind. Knowledge about where and when to find certain foods was passed on within the group. One person knew where edible roots grew, another knew where to find mushrooms, and a third knew where to look for wild bee nests. This exchange of information made survival much more efficient. People did not act alone. Their strength lay in the collective and in their accumulated knowledge. They did not just survive, but learn from their experiences, improving their skills with each new generation. These practices, although seemingly primitive, were the basis for the development of more complex technologies. For example, the ability to grind grain and nuts led to the creation of the first mortars and pestles. And food storage skills became the basis for the development of agriculture, which allowed humans to settle in one place. Thus, the hunger menu was not just a way out of a situation, but a catalyst that pushed humanity to the next stage of evolution. What else besides food and fire do you think was critical to their survival that we don't even know about? The entire food system of primitive people was aimed at one goal: survival. Their diet varied depending on the season, location, and available resources. They were true opportunists who did not disdain anything that could be eaten. It was this flexibility that allowed them to adapt to a wide variety of conditions. For example, in the north, where plant-based foods were scarce, their diet consisted mainly of meat, fish, and fat. Our ancestors hunted mammoths, bison, and deer. But as we have already mentioned, they used not only meat, but also bones and even entrails to obtain all the necessary nutrients. In warmer regions where there were many plants, the diet consisted mainly of fruits, tubers, nuts, and seeds. In these conditions, our ancestors learned to distinguish between hundreds of species of edible plants and to gather them. They used primitive tools to gather and process food, which made their diet even more diverse. This shows that the diet of primitive man was not static, but very flexible and adaptive. They were masters of survival who knew how to get the most out of everything around them. They didn't just eat what they found, but also learned to process and store food, which was a real technological breakthrough. The Stone Age diet was determined not only by the available food, but also by its nutritional value. They understood perfectly well that some parts of animals, such as the brain and entrails, contain more fat and vitamins than meat. This knowledge was critical for survival, especially in harsh winter conditions. It is also important to note that our ancestors were able to eat seasonally. In the spring, when the first shoots and leaves appeared, they actively gathered plant foods. In summer and autumn, they gathered berries, fruits, and nuts. In winter, when plant foods became unavailable, they switched to hunting and consuming fats and proteins. This cyclical approach to nutrition was very effective and allowed them to maintain a balance of nutrients in the body. In addition, they used fire not only for cooking, but also for purifying water. This was one of the most important discoveries that allowed them to avoid many diseases. Thus, primitive people were not just hunters, but true survival engineers. They used every bit of knowledge about nature to increase their chances of survival. Their diet depended on many factors, including the climate, flora, and fauna of the region, and even animal migration. When large game moved to other territories, our ancestors did not go without food. They switched to smaller prey, birds, fish, and rodents. Fishing, for example, was no less important than hunting mammoths, especially in regions with rivers and lakes. Archaeological finds show that the diet of ancient people even included mollusks and crustaceans. This suggests that they were true masters at using all available natural resources, from land to water. Have you ever wondered how flexible our ancestors' diet was? The answer will surprise you. So, the hunger menu is not just a set of foods. It is a comprehensive survival system that included knowledge, skills, and practices. It was a philosophy that allowed our ancestors to survive in the harshest conditions. They learned to see food where we, modern people, see only inedible things. They created a system that allowed our species not only to survive, but also to become dominant on the planet. Today, we can only admire their resourcefulness and ingenuity. They were true masters of survival who were able to adapt to a wide variety of conditions. Their experience shows that human nature is very flexible and that our bodies are capable of surviving in the most extreme situations. This knowledge can be useful to us too, because today, living in a world of abundance, we have forgotten what it means to survive. Let's imagine what a survival menu might look like in a primitive restaurant. The main course, Hunter's Feast. This was usually the meat of a large animal, such as a mammoth, bison, or deer. But it wasn't just a steak. It included roasted liver, rich in vitamin C, bone marrow, rich in fat and calories, and dried meat, a reserve in case of famine. This dish required enormous effort, weeks of tracking, deadly hunting, and collective work. Appetizer, gifts of the forest and field. Depending on the season, this could be an assortment of wild herbs and roots, such as tubers, wild bulbs, or cattail roots. Cost, many hours of digging with primitive sticks, as well as the risk of poisoning if edible plants were confused with poisonous ones. Dessert, sweet reward. If you were lucky, wild honey or hand-picked berries were served for dessert. It was not just a dessert, but a source of quick energy. Cost, the risk of being stung by wild bees or encountering a bear, which also likes to feast on honey. Special offer from the chef, bone soup. Bones were not thrown away. They were broken and boiled to obtain a nutritious broth. This was not only very nutritious, but also allowed the maximum amount of nutrients to be extracted from the bones. Cost, hours of work by the fire, but it was an investment in health and survival. Now let's move on to the exotic section. It was especially relevant in the hungriest times. The exotic section, unusual finds. This section could feature a fish plate that consisted not of meat, but of caviar. Yes, that's right. Fish roe was a very nutritious source of protein and fat, and harvesting it did not require as much effort as hunting large animals. In addition, our ancestors even ate mushrooms, but not the ones we are familiar with, but tinder fungi. These mushrooms were not only a source of fiber and other nutrients, but were also used as medicine. Another delicacy was carrion left by predators. The risk of getting sick was high, but when it came to survival, this risk was justified. Our ancestors also knew how to use almost everything. They could even eat algae and shellfish if they lived on the coast. These were additional sources of nutrients that did not require much effort to obtain. All these dishes were not just food, but the result of the science of survival. Our ancestors were true engineers who used every bit of knowledge about nature to survive another day. This experience shows that the human body is capable of incredible things when it comes to survival. This knowledge about the starvation menu is not just interesting facts, but living proof of incredible human adaptability and ingenuity. It reminds us that our ancestors were not only hunters, but also clever gatherers who knew how to use every available resource. This became the basis for our survival and prosperity as a species. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more videos like this, please write in the comments what topics from history, science, or evolution you would be interested in. We welcome your ideas, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.